Morning, everybody. So this is part two of our discussion of Hinduism. And when we had initially made up the schedule, the plan was for me to provide a sweeping overview of the entire Hindu tradition in the first session, and then we'd be able to devote the second session largely to contemporary concerns. And I still want to touch on the contemporary concerns, and hopefully I'll have about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session to do that, because this is a time of ferment in Hinduism in a number of ways. So I'll be touching on those things, but the central goal today is to really talk about how how classical Hinduism really solves some of the challenges that are posed by what comes before it in India. And we spent a bit of time last session talking about the sort of the common themes that you find in the Eastern traditions generally, a concern with karmic energy that is primarily responsible for rebirth. The cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is fundamental to Buddhism as well as Hinduism, and we'll be talking about Buddhism and Jainism, two very similar traditions, next week. And we talked about how escaping this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth really becomes the pursuit of those spiritual seekers who move off into the wilderness and take up very rigorous ascetic practices, controlling their breathing, fasting, going long periods of time without sleep. They were spiritual seekers to the extreme, and they posed a lot of the challenges in the 6th century BCE, about 2,500 years ago, that Hinduism was a response to. Buddhism was itself a response to these kinds of concerns. But Hinduism takes a very different approach than Buddhism. And so that's really what we're going to be focusing on principally this morning. And so we're going to start by looking at a portion of the Mahabharata, one of the great epic pieces of literature in the Hindu tradition. And we're focusing on the Bhagavad Gita in particular. This is the Song of God, is its rough translation. And it's really been regarded as the Bible of Hinduism in some ways, and so we're going to take a look at that. So this is text 3 in your handout. It's page 6, I believe. And at the heart of the Gita is a battle, but it's what's really most important about this is Arjuna, the warrior who's about to go into battle, and he is torn because he knows that in this battle he's going to be fighting his family and friends, people who are dear to him, and yet he is a Kshatriya, which means he is a warrior. This is his class. He must fight, and so he's essentially got conflicting obligations here. We did talk a bit about the 4-class system, which was set up as early as the Vedic period, probably about 1000 BCE or so, with Brahmin priests at the top, Kshatriya, who would be governmental officials, warriors, the 2nd class, Vaishya, who would be farmers, merchants, and then Shudra, the bottom of the 4 classes. So Arjuna is a Kshatriya, so he is obligated to fight in this cataclysmic battle that comprises much of the Mahabharata, but he is torn. And he's fortunate, though, because Krishna, who is an incarnation of Vishnu, many of the gods of Hinduism have avatars, or they're incarnate versions of themselves. And so that's Krishna here in this case. And Krishna happens to be the charioteer for Arjuna, and he offers him the wisdom that will help him understand why, and not only why he must fight, but how he must fight. There is a specific kind of approach that Arjuna needs to take in order to maintain his righteousness as he engages in battle. So we're now, this is the passage that begins, "Your words are wise, Arjuna." "Your words are wise, Arjuna, but your sorrow is for nothing. The truly wise mourn neither for the living nor for the dead. There was never a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor any of these kings, nor is there any future in which we shall cease to be. Just as the dweller in this body passes through childhood, youth, and old age, so at death he merely passes into another kind of body. The wise are not deceived by that. Feelings of heat and cold, pleasure and pain are caused by the contact of the senses with their objects. They come and go, never lasting long. You must accept them. A serene spirit accepts pleasure and pain with an even mind and is unmoved by either. He alone is worthy of immortality." So in this passage, we see Krishna reiterating the basic framework of the Upanishads. Maya, which is the world of apparent reality, is what blinds us to the true nature of Brahman, the world soul, because it obscures from us the truth that all beings are one. Since the illusion of separate beings is influencing Arjuna's reluctance to take part in the battle, it is something he must shake off so that he can fulfill his obligations as a warrior. Instead of shedding tears for those that he is about to slay in battle, he needs to realize that in fact the battle itself is part of a cosmic illusion, one that he has to eventually transcend. And given that it is an illusion, and the illusion of separate selves is what's trapping him here, then Krishna is essentially trying to liberate Arjuna from his false understandings. But Krishna does not stop there, and this is critical. He goes on to promise Arjuna that if he engages in battle not for selfish reasons, bloodlust, desire for renown, or other motives, but out of devotion to Vishnu, his actions will become righteous and he will be rewarded. And so Krishna goes on. Those whose minds are fixed on me in steadfast love, worshiping me with absolute faith, I consider them to have the greater understanding of yoga. Quickly I come to those who offer me every action, worship me only, their dearest delight, with devotion undaunted. Because they love me, these are my bondsmen, and I shall save them from mortal sorrow and all the waves of life's deathly ocean. Be absorbed in me, lodge your mind in me, thus you shall dwell in me. Do not doubt it, here and hereafter. So this then becomes the solution to Arjuna's dilemma. By focusing his mind and heart solely on Krishna, again, who is Vishnu, he obtains the self-renunciation needed to perform his class duty by going to war. But rather than accumulating bad karma as a result of bloodlust or vengeance through the killing that will follow, by practicing the yoga of devotion, what comes to be known as bhakti yoga, he can continue his self-renunciation and thus achieve good karma. So in this way, Arjuna becomes a righteous warrior, pure in heart and mind. And this is where we see the many paths to God that are found in Hinduism. We have now then 3 different kinds of yoga that are available to devotees of Hinduism. And so here this is under Roman numeral 5, part B. All right, this is how the practice of yoga evolves under Hinduism. In the Upanishads, the quest for asceticism really limited the practice of yoga to this very, very rigorous kind of renunciation. One has to overcome desire, one has to overcome the self, one has to leave everything behind in order to seek righteousness, which is really, again, just another form of self-renunciation. And that's retained in Hinduism. You still have the practice of jnana yoga, which is essentially meditation and asceticism, but added to that, you have karma yoga, which is the way in which you fulfill your duty to your class. And this is what Arjuna must do as a Kshatriya warrior. He must go into battle because that is his cosmic responsibility. And by doing so in the right frame of mind and in the right state of his soul, then he can generate positive karma, which is a benefit in itself. But then again, added to that, these first 2 versions of yoga, we now have bhakti yoga. And that is yoga that is simply directed to worshiping and serving the gods. And so Vishnu makes himself available for Arjuna's help in this case by saying, when you go into battle, do that for me. And out of devotion to me, you will earn good karma. And make sure that in the heat of the battle, he's not accumulating bad karma. So this becomes another path to righteousness. And it's really bhakti yoga that takes the form of puja in classical and contemporary Hinduism. This is the way in which, by serving the gods, by being devoted to the gods wholeheartedly, one earns karmic righteousness that is eventually, now it may take many lifetimes. This is not something that happens instantaneously, but the idea is that over the course of one's life and the lives to follow, that the accumulation of good karma will put oneself in a better position to eventually achieve moksha, or the liberation, the spiritual liberation that was sought by the seekers in the period of the Upanishads. So what eventually evolves with this concept of puja is a much more participatory, inclusive, and I mean, to be blunt about it, it's a much more enjoyable way for people to practice their faith. Unlike the very rigorous daunting kind of practice of original yoga meditation that the seekers in the Upanishads had outlined. This is a religion that is available to anyone, regardless of class and regardless of one's station in life. And so puja becomes the way in which the religion can incorporate everyone into a very celebratory, jubilant kind of worship experience, very unlike the much more dour and bleak view of the Upanishads by comparison. It doesn't mean that the older concerns have been swept away. The concern of moksha, of being freed, of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, that's still foremost on the religious agenda, but it's now a distant goal. It's not one that has to be achieved in this lifetime. It's not one that has to be sought with all one's heart. In fact, in many cases, that's something that will happen some lifetime down the road. In the meantime, there's life to be lived. One can have a family. One can have their career path as dictated by their class responsibilities in the Dharma, and enjoy the good things of life. That's built into the Hindu religious system. So if you look at under Roman numeral 5, part E, we have some crucial delineations that take place here. We have the four ends of man, as they are called, starting, of course, with one's class duty. Class obligations still persist, and of course, that's a way that you accumulate karma. That's karmic yoga, as we defined it a second ago. Artha, which is the quest for material wealth, the means to a flourishing existence. Kama, or pleasure, is also one of the four ends of man, and then moksha is there, but again, it's now rendered a much more distant objective, and that kind of goes alongside the four stages of life. That you're going to find oneself in different places as you go through life, whether you're a student, a householder, or one of the renunciants, a forest dweller, or eventually the homeless wanderer. So when one is in the right place spiritually and in the right stage of life, one can engage in this quest to leave it all behind, to transcend desire, to transcend those things that are keeping us in Maya, this world of illusion. But until you're ready for that, that can remain a goal on the horizon. In the meantime, there are gods to be worshipped. And it's a very celebratory kind of faith in that sense. Again, a much more compelling alternative in some ways to the much more bleak vision of the Upanishads. And so in that sense, you can see the way in which Hinduism is a solution to the old dilemma. How do you have a religion that understands the ultimate quest in life to be one of renunciation without having society crumble as a result, right? I mean, society will need to perpetuate itself, and the way that it does that is because most people are actually going to be about the business of keeping the society flourishing and having families and having jobs and so forth. It's just that very small spiritual elect who are going to leave it all behind and essentially become homeless wanderers who go from place to place begging for their food and essentially not giving any thought to the desires of the body because they are close to achieving moksha. And that's where you can kind of see a monastic tradition emerge here too within Hinduism. So what I thought I would do is give you some images and some things to look at, because the one thing that's so striking about Hinduism, one of the many things that's striking about Hinduism, is how bold and colorful and vibrant it is as a tradition. If Hinduism had never come about and we were in the worldview of the Upanishads, this would be a much shorter presentation, because your one objective would be to renounce everything. And then, so anything that engages the senses is actually anathema from the standpoint of the Upanishads. It's a danger, it's a trap, keeps us locked in the world of Maya, of illusion. But Hinduism is quite the opposite. In fact, it's an extremely sensory religious experience. So to give you just a taste of that, I thought I would bring in some images. Yeah, that would be awesome. Okay, so Pastor Misha is going to help me here by enlarging these slides, which admittedly, okay, are too small. This is Vishnu. Okay, and Vishnu is one of the three dominant gods in contemporary Hinduism. Vishnu is a protector god. He is benevolent. He's usually depicted with a serene smile on his face. lot of imagery that surrounds the various gods in the ways that they're commonly depicted, much of which I won't be able to interpret for you, unfortunately. Although you will notice that a lot of the Hindu deities are depicted with 4 arms. And this is highly symbolic. The 4 arms can represent the 4 points on the compass. They can represent the 4 seasons. Each hand is usually holding something of significance. In this case, this is a discus, which can be used as a weapon, but can also be used to symbolize the cosmos. He's also holding a mace here, because he is a protector, so therefore, you know, he has to be able to defend people when war is needed. But anyway, he's often depicted with blue skin, because and Krishna in particular, probably his dominant incarnation is often depicted as having blue skin, because well, there's several stories involved here. One of which is that he was poisoned early in his existence, and the blue represents that fact. But I'm not going to dwell on that a whole lot. But let's go to the next picture. Okay. I don't think you're going to be able to use that because it's. Oh no, here we go. Oh, wonderful. Okay. This is the celebration of Diwali, the season of light, and it symbolizes the victory of light over darkness. It's a highly participatory and jubilant celebration, and coming up soon. Yes, in November. Yeah. Okay, and there's another, that's a temple that has been adorned to celebrate Diwali. Okay. Okay, and this is an image of Ganesha. And Ganesha is probably the most popular Hindu god right now in contemporary Hinduism. There are numerous festivals to Ganesha all over India and throughout the world, wherever Hindus are found. Ganesha is the god he is known as the remover of obstacles. So whenever one is undertaking a new venture or going through some sort of hardship or struggle, Ganesha is a god who will assist the faithful. He also is typically depicted as having 4 arms. He has a human body but an elephant head. There's a story behind that. There's many stories behind that. I don't know it. You want to tell?
I know it. This is one of my favorite stories. I'm not Hindu, but I'm Indian, so I did grow up with this story. So Ganesh was the son of the god Shiva, and Shiva was married to Parvati. And Shiva had to go away. He had to go away for some sort of battle or something. And so I can't remember if he either didn't know about his new son Ganesh, or Ganesh was born and it was 7 years later. No, he didn't know. That's right. He didn't know he had a son. So Parvati was about to go take a bath. And so she told her son Ganesh, don't let anybody come in for any reason. You know, you are to protect me. And of course, that's the moment that Lord Shiva decided to come home. And he's coming home to see his wife Parvati, and there's this boy who refuses to let him in. So Shiva, who has a tendency to lose his temper, and that's a bad thing because Shiva has a third eye, and when the third eye opens, he's mad, and that's destruction of the whole world. So Shiva sort of lost his temper and said, nobody prevents me from seeing my beloved, and he cuts off the kid's head. And Parvati comes running out and saying, what have you done to your son? And so she said, go and find the first animal that you see and bring me his head. And the first animal was an elephant. So the head was put on, Ganesh lived, and he had a head of an elephant, and he was just considered always to be the one of caring and security and the embodiment of love. And that's the story.
So I love this photo because this guy's just having a great old time. I mean, that looks awesome. You know, and these festivals are so popular, and there'll be thousands and thousands and thousands of people who will come to behold the various murtis. That murti is the term that they will use for the representation of the deity, whether in statue form in a temple or sometimes larger than life form brought through various villages. The Murtis sometimes go on tour, essentially, and they're brought to various villages so that people who might have a hard time getting to a temple on a regular basis can still participate. And interestingly, a lot of these festivals in honor of Ganesh end with the Murtis actually being taken out into the water, and they sink. They essentially sink these statues into the water, and they put a great deal of money into making these statues so lavish, and there's gold involved and lots of other. It's quite lavish and luxurious, and then they just take the Murtis and sink them. So anyway, that's Ganesh. Okay, and this one we have to enlarge a bit. Now, this is the festival of Holi. Holi, which in addition to Diwali is probably the most well-known Hindu festivals. This is a festival of color. Generally, again, very auspicious festival. It celebrates the triumph of good over evil. And the celebrations usually involve people taking colored dyes and tossing the dye at each other. So it makes just a riot of color, really, as this is celebrated. That's right. Diwali is autumn and Holi is spring. Yes. Yeah. Okay. And this is Krishna, who we read about in the story of Arjuna. Okay. Probably one of the best known, the dominant avatar or incarnation of Vishnu. And he is again depicted as having blue skin. You'll notice he has only 2 arms here because this is his human incarnation. This is not Vishnu, but Krishna in human. So Vishnu in human form. Okay. And this again is Ganesh. Okay. And you see, he's Ganesh is always up for a party. So there he is, usually shown with a lot of food in his possession. So he's always having a good time. Okay. And this is in a temple. And this would be puja. So essentially, they are doing honor and worshiping, serving the various gods. The term for this is darshana, which generally has to do with the ritual interaction with the deities. Okay, and that can take different forms. One of which is to feed the gods. So they will bring food of various kinds and present it to each murti, which represents a different deity. And again, the overall spirit here is one of celebration, and everyone's having a good time, and it's a jubilant kind of event. It really is. So, I think I've got a couple examples of puja. Here's another one. Yes. Here. Is darshana related to dharma? I don't think they share the same origins. Yeah. No, that's a good question. No. So this is another. Interior of a temple, and the various murtis that are being revered and celebrated. Okay. Okay, and this is Lakshmi, who is a goddess of good fortune, and she also happens to be the wife of Vishnu. And probably among the various Hindu goddesses, a very, very popular one. Again, in keeping in part with Vishnu's role as a provider, as a protector, as a generous, loving, benevolent god. So Lakshmi is also known as the goddess of wealth. So when one's starting a new business, for instance, or any kind of entrepreneurial venture, Lakshmi would be a goddess to whom prayers would be offered. The various Hindu goddesses have a power that is known as Shakti, which is essentially one way in which the god's power can be administered. So by going to the goddess for blessings, she's not only providing her own blessings, but she's also transmitting the blessings of Vishnu in this case.
When I was growing up, my mom would tell us about Lakshmi, and there was a saying that she gave us, that when Lakshmi came to the door to put a chanlo, the red dot, right, to put a chanlo on your face, don't go and wash your hands. In other words, when wealth comes and when goodness comes, be ready to accept it. That's
what Okay, and this is Shiva. And Shiva is such a fascinating god, because as Pastor Misha was saying, Shiva has a violent side. He's often depicted with the trident, so he's ready to do battle if necessary. But he's also frequently depicted in a lotus pose, because he's also a god of the Upanishads. He also seeks to renounce the world of Maya and to achieve enlightenment. And so he also often has a very serene countenance on his face because he's on the path to enlightenment or moksha. So he's a contradictory god in some ways because he's the god of the eternal cycle. So he is the god of creation, but he's also the god of destruction. And so sometimes he's depicted, some of the statues of Shiva have him depicted in the posture of someone who's dancing. And his is the cosmic dance that brings about this, perpetuates the cycle of creation and ultimately destruction. Okay, I think there's just one or two more. Okay, and there's Shiva and Parvati, who is his wife, and again, she transmits Shakti on behalf of Shiva. Okay. And this is what's often referred to as the Trimurti. Now, this is very interesting for Christians, because this is, if you were to talk about the Hindu Trinity, this would be it. And it's kind of interesting. Vishnu is the one in the middle, and then Shiva is to his left, but to Vishnu's right, you have Brahma. And Brahma is one of the earliest gods mentioned in the Vedic scriptures. And yet in classical Hinduism, and especially in contemporary Hinduism, Brahma doesn't get a whole lot of attention. And so even though these three are considered to be all part of the Godhead of Brahman, Brahma is often depicted as having multiple faces to signify that Brahma is aware of everything that is going on. He's sometimes regarded as sort of an overarching deity, and a very benevolent deity, but again, in terms of puja and the way in which the gods are served and the amount of devotion that he gets relative to the other deities, he would be third on the list. But anyway, just in terms of the Trinitarian perspective that we bring as Christians, it is kind of interesting that you have a three-in-one concept going on here in Hinduism as well. Okay. Okay, yeah, so is there a similar kind of debate in Hinduism analogous to the iconoclastic controversies that we've had in Christianity over the centuries? It's a great question. There's such a proliferation of images of the deities that we see in Hinduism. I don't know that within the Hindu tradition that you've had that kind of controversy. Where the controversies develop is over other traditions that will be rivals to Hinduism in the Indian subcontinent. Okay, now one of those is going to be Buddhism. Buddhism, especially in its original form, Theravada Buddhism, or the Buddhism of the ancients, as it's referred to, is very much a religion that doesn't depend on worship of deities at all. It is the worldview of the Upanishads, it is the worldview of renunciation, and that's all on you. You have no gods to assist you in that. And so sometimes early Buddhism is referred to as an atheistic religion. So they're absolutely in contrast with this rich, polytheistic tradition of Hinduism. Jainism also serves in some ways as a foil to this aspect of Hinduism, which we'll be talking about next week. So Jainism and Buddhism are kind of aligned in that way, although there's some important differences between Jainism and Buddhism. But that's, yeah, some of the controversies in contemporary Hinduism are pretty potent ones, but I don't know that they have to do with, what is the right way or what is the wrong way to depict the gods and murtis and the way that they're worshipped. the one thing about Hinduism, I think, that's allowed it to persist and flourish as it has over the centuries is that the general spirit, at least until very, very recently with the rise of Hindu fundamentalism, has been anything goes. I mean, this is what has allowed Hinduism, and I don't mean to be glib about it, but I mean Hinduism has been able to incorporate so many different kinds of cultures and peoples, and the religion has expanded because they've been adaptable in pulling in some of these indigenous worship practices and making them part of the Hindu tradition. This is one reason why it's so challenging to get a bead on what exactly Hinduism is, because depending on where in India you're talking about, or where in the United States you're talking about, or right, because it has become a world religion, that the religion's going to have very different forms and practices and gods. You know, some gods are worshipped only in remote parts of India, whereas other gods like Vishnu or Ganesh are much more universal for Hindus. But it's that fluidity that has allowed Hinduism to incorporate so many different kinds of perspectives and to flourish. Pastor Misha, you have a question? And along the same lines, when Pastor Amish and I were married 20-some years ago, and we met with the sadhu, or the Hindu priest, who would, we had two ceremonies. We had a Christian ceremony and we had a Hindu wedding ceremony the same day. But when we were meeting for our premarital counseling, essentially, and I was nervous because I thought, you know, here I am. I don't share this tradition, and Manisha didn't really share the tradition at the time either. We were doing it largely to honor Manisha's parents and the tradition and so forth. But when he found out that I was Christian, he was very enthused, and he said, "Oh, we honor Lord Jesus," and that was just an expression that I didn't expect to hear. I was really caught off guard by that, but there was such a tranquility and an openness that was striking. I was profoundly humbled by that conversation with him. Question? Yeah, Roger's question is a great one, because one of the things that I wanted to bring up, now we're transitioning into the contemporary moment here. These are 21st century challenges, really, that Hinduism as a tradition is dealing with. And one of them is precisely the question of who gets to speak for Hinduism, who gets to interpret the religion, who is equipped really to do justice to the tradition. And this is, Wendy Doniger has featured prominently in our discussion of the Eastern traditions and Hinduism. She is regarded as probably the foremost Western expert on Hinduism, but she is most certainly not a Hindu herself, and she's a Westerner. She's not a Hindu, Indian Hindu person, and yet she writes voluminously on the tradition. She's recently had a book, it's called Hinduism and Alternative History, which was very widely regarded by Hindu scholars worldwide, including many Indian scholars of Hinduism. But there was a movement just a few years ago that she's referring to in this article in the New York Review of Books to have her book banned in India because of some of the assertions that she made, which were offending the Hindutva movement, which is sort of Hindu fundamentalism. One of the arguments that people in the Hindu fundamentalist movement will make is that contemporary depictions of Hinduism, especially by people outside the tradition, are distortive. They tend to focus on aspects of the tradition that aren't essential. And some of these folks will argue that we get a skewed perspective here because people refer, for instance, to Hinduism as being a polytheistic faith, when in fact all these various manifestations of the divine are representative of one Godhead. So if we think back on the Trimurti, that could be seen as a concept of three in one, just like Christians don't regard the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as different deities. They are manifestations of the same Godhead. So there are some in contemporary India who challenge Westerners' depiction of it because they say, well, they just can't get it. They can't understand this richness and complexity in the proper context. And one of the folks who's received their ire is Wendy Doniger for some of the assertions that she's made and some of the characterizations she's made of the faith. This is a profoundly complicated question. It's a complicated question that every tradition has to deal with. And in this sense, I was thinking back on Father Bill's points from the first couple sessions, is that when a world religion takes shape as a world religion, it then becomes something that can be engaged by people both within and without the tradition. And traditions respond to that in various ways. Right? You can receive that with a kind of generosity and say, well, this tradition isn't just for us, it's for everyone, and so it can be interpreted by anyone. Or conversely, you can retreat into a much more defensive posture, and that's typically how various fundamentalisms within the tradition have operated. Right? This is for us, and nobody else can really interpret it because they haven't experienced it the way that we have. They haven't been touched by this faith the way that we have. And right now, in contemporary India, there's very much a fundamentalist movement, somewhat linked to the BJP, the current ruling party in India. And it's taken some nasty forms at times. In fact, just in today's New York Times, there was an opinion piece on some of the writers who have believed to have been killed by Hindu fundamentalists because they've made assertions that, for instance, the Hindu deities aren't real. Or that the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, the epic literature that we've been talking about, is fiction. And so there's, just as you've had Christian fundamentalisms over the centuries, you've also got a pretty virulent form of Hindu fundamentalism right now in India. And it's also affecting debate in the United States. For instance, the way in which textbooks are depicting Hinduism for middle or high school students are being very carefully scrutinized by powerful Hindu fundamentalist forces who want to make sure that, well, if you're going to mention caste, you have to do it in the right way. Okay, if you're going to talk about the various Hindu gods, you have to do it in the right way. And given how complex the Hindu tradition is, you can understand these debates are very fraught and complicated. So it's a great question, not one that we can really resolve, but it's a debate that's certainly plaguing contemporary India. The other issue I wanted to point to very quickly is the issue of caste. And we've talked about this mainly in terms of the four classes, the four fundamental classes that are outlined in the Vedic scriptures. Castes are really subclasses within these four classes. And again, that's one of the ways in which Hinduism has expanded, is by having subcastes which can incorporate different kinds of people within the tradition. But caste presents a very big challenge in India, in part because very many of what are known as the Dalits or the untouchables, millions and millions of people who are regarded essentially as lower than low within the caste hierarchy, are trying to gain access to jobs, college education, and much else in Indian society. And when India gained its independence from Britain in 1947, the Constitution was very explicit that, legally speaking, caste would no longer determine one's fate in life. All were to be treated equally. And yet, because of centuries and centuries and centuries of discrimination, it's very hard to take people who have been regarded as lower than low and then suddenly find a level playing field. And so one of the policies that's emerged recently in India is that of what would be analogous to American affirmative action, that less represented castes, or Dalits or untouchables, or however you want to describe them, will be given preferential treatment for college admissions, government jobs, and so forth. Well, there's been a pushback recently against that policy, with some arguing. This fellow here, Hardik Patel, has become rather notorious for taking up this issue and saying, well, this is inherently discriminatory, right? That my people are being disadvantaged because we're not in one of the castes that is getting this kind of affirmative action. So we're on the outs, while people who happen to be born into the right castes are getting preferential treatment across the board. And so this too has stirred a controversy. And again, it's one that has certain analogies for us in the United States. I mean, how do you move toward a society that is colorblind? Well, there are those who say that affirmative action is necessary to do that, because if you don't, you can't possibly have a level playing field. right? And then there are others who would say, well, no, the route to a colorblind society is to essentially disregard color in any way, shape, or form in public policy. The very same debate is playing out in India. The problem there is even more pervasive because it's estimated that probably between 1/5 and 1/6 of the Indian population is from a caste of Dalits, untouchables. So it's a huge part of the Indian population. The question of how to integrate them into modern Indian society is one that's, it's a huge challenge for people in India right now. Eric. It has, yeah, how do you determine what caste you're in? And this is really on the basis of family, lineage. There are elements of skin tone involved, but that goes back to the Vedic period when this whole business began, maybe 1000 BCE. But it's essentially on the basis of family birth. And especially in rural parts of India, I mean, we do know that India is becoming urbanized and modernized at an alarming rate. I mean, it's the fantastic challenges in that regard. But in rural parts of India, where caste continues to guide the culture of the society in profound ways, there's no escaping it. People know who your parents are. People know who their parents were. So in rural parts of India in particular, it has been really, really hard to uproot this caste consciousness and to try to move beyond it. There's no question. And so in those rural parts of India, it's going to be really unusual for people even to contemplate marrying outside of their caste. And you have local councils who are entrusted with this kind of communal memory and will make sure that everybody understands how this must work. Now, what happens when young people go off to the big city to go to college? Well, sometimes they fall in love with someone from a different caste, and this can pose enormous challenges for people who come from these rural parts of India where they're supposed to answer to their parents and they're supposed to answer to those village elders who are entrusted with maintaining this system despite the fact that the law and the Constitution suggest otherwise. So, I mean, and it shouldn't surprise us. We're talking about a tradition that is thousands of years in the making, and to think that that can be uprooted within a couple of generations would probably be rather miraculous. But this is definitely one of the challenges that modern Hindus have to face, and modern India has to face. These are challenges that are political as well as religious. We have to get a clear sense of that. Judge Moore, question? Well, that's a great question. How do we broaden our focus to go beyond just beliefs, ritual practices, and talk about the ethics of the various traditions? And the reason why that's helpful to keep in mind is because really when it comes to ethics and the morality of the various world traditions, we can see them converge in most ways. I mean, there are some differences. The fact that the Eastern religions tend to practice vegetarianism, for instance, and the idea that every living creature has a soul, and therefore eating meat is verboten, is something that differentiates Eastern religions from the Western ones generally. But in terms of loving one's neighbor, and in terms of being devoted to the other before oneself, you see these norms pop up again and again and again in all the world's faiths. So if one of the goals of our endeavor here is to bridge what separates the world religions and to help us achieve mutual understanding and respect, oftentimes that's where people want to start, is by looking at the ethical injunctions of the various world faiths, because that's often where we can see the most convergence. If we're talking about the number of gods that are worshipped in Hinduism, and we contrast that with the rigorous monotheism of the Western traditions, that can pull us in the other direction. But to come together and to try to forge those bonds of respect and mutuality, sometimes the ethical traditions and the way they overlap is the way to go. The Hindu tradition absolutely celebrates nonviolence, and it's kind of interesting to assert that, given the Mahabharata, which is basically a humongous story about warfare, right? But that too, especially in recent decades, and the influence of Gandhi cannot be overstated here, to reread these traditions really by emphasizing the value of peace and harmony as opposed to conflict. And this is why a lot of people are alarmed with the rise of the Hindu fundamentalist movement, because it seems to be taking back to an era where you know, this is about a mighty India. This is an India for India, as opposed to an India which welcomes in all sorts of other traditions, including Muslims and Sikhs and many other folk. But I think you're absolutely right to point that out. And regrettably, given the format and the fact that we have so little time to spend on each tradition, we tend to focus more on core understandings, beliefs, practices, rather than the ethical side of things, where we would see a lot of common ground between the various traditions. Are we pretty much out of time? Okay, yeah. Thanks everyone. So next week it'll be Buddhism and Jainism with the help of Pastor Manisha.